outside? Should I run and hide? How do I take my company worldwide? Do you love the law? Did you watch Hee-Haw? What's the weirdest thing that you ever saw? What's it like in court? Favorite sport? Can you help with my book report? Is my hair too long? Am I right or wrong? And do you mind if I sing along to anything? Ask Alan anything in the world.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Ask Alan, the podcast. My name is Alan Crone. I'm the CEO of the Crone Law Firm, and we've got a fascinating guest today. I'm really looking forward to learning a lot. Dr. Andrew Olney at the University of Memphis. Dr. Olney, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're studying and what your area of emphasis is?
Right, so glad to be with you. So my research focus is on applications of artificial intelligence to education. I specifically focus on natural language processing. So this is the analysis of text. And of course, there's a lot of reading that goes on in education. So there's lots of places to do that kind of research. Started at the university about 20 years ago and have been working in this area ever since. A lot of it involves what we call tutoring systems. So our emphasis, actually our signature at the University of Memphis that we're known internationally for this, is conversational intelligent tutoring systems. So these are computer programs that you can talk to, you can have a conversation with. And oftentimes there's a human-looking avatar, right? So you're talking to like a computer character on the screen, and that character knows something about whatever the subject is. It could be biology or physics or whatever, and then tries to teach you. And that's what we're really known for. So a lot of my work, especially my early work, revolves around that.
Well, I'm going to ask maybe a silly question. But for a lot of people who aren't familiar with the concept, how does artificial intelligence work? What's going on behind the scenes as I'm having that conversation with the avatar? What is the computer doing in order to facilitate that conversation? Right.
So there's a couple of sub questions in that. So we can talk a little bit about the history of AI. So, people often associate AI with computers, and that's not wrong. I mean, that's a conventional view, and you can trace it back to, say, the 1950s. Alan Turing, actually, who's considered to be the grandfather of computing, although some people like to debate that. But he was very interested in artificial intelligence type concepts. And from that, we have the Turing test, right, which you famously see in a number of movies, like Ex Machina was a recent movie that involved that. But if you look at the history with a little bit more of an open mind, and you consider computers before the digital age, because there actually were like steam engine type computers, like Babbage's analytical engine and stuff like that. If you start thinking in that way, then you can really see the forerunners of artificial intelligence going back hundreds of years into things that involve like clockwork and so forth. So it really is kind of a fascinating topic to think about where AI has come from. I would argue AI has been with us for a really, really long time. And what's been happening is whenever we develop a new technology, whatever the technology of the age is, right? So now we're in the whatever generation computer age, and we have the internet and so forth. We're thinking in smartphones and things, we're thinking of AI in terms of like our smartphones and talking to our smartphones and these computer programs and so forth. But if you go back in history, you'll find that there were similar instantiations of AI. They just looked different because we just had different technology to work with at that point in time. So going back to the other part of your question with the intelligent tutoring systems. So again, kind of a history thing. These systems were imagined in the 1970s using what we would consider today to be very old kind of AI. So the more kind of symbolic AI. And of course, now almost everything is neural networks like that you hear about, deep learning. And so with these systems, it's actually fairly easy in some ways for the AI problems. You have very simple planning. You typically approach a domain of knowledge, like I was using biology and physics and so forth. So you would model what an expert knows in those domains. And then you would use that model of expert knowledge to teach a student. So when the student would say something, like give an answer to a question, you would compare what they said to this expert model of knowledge. And if there were things missing or incorrect, you would use that expert model to tell the student, hey, you left these things out, or there's something else. You know, you said something, you're confusing these concepts, or whatever the appropriate response would be. And so, but what makes it really interesting is that if you're having a conversation, there's so much ambiguity in conversations. I think you as a lawyer probably appreciate this very well, right? This is why we have like contract law and, you know, very precise language around some of these concepts, is because natural language is just so ambiguous. So if the student was speaking like these AI symbols, it would be really easy for the machine to like figure it out. But when the student is speaking natural language, and you know what students are like too, right? Like they're trying to like if they don't know the answer, they don't say, I don't know the answer. They try to kind of like give an answer that's not really an answer, but they're like trying to convince you that it is. So that makes it a lot more interesting and challenging for the AI. And so especially when it comes to some of these natural language issues, we do use deep learning and whatever the current, you know, cutting edge approaches are. But like the core intelligent tutoring system engine that's underneath tends to use a much older technology.
Well, let me ask you this, going back to this concept of what would it be appropriate to say a binary artificial intelligence, a non-digital artificial intelligence? What would be an example of a mechanism that people may be familiar with that would fall under that definition?
You mean like the kind of historical AI that I was talking about?
Yes, sir.
So one example that I like is Vaucanson's duck. So this was a clockwork automata of a duck. Okay, so if you can imagine somebody took the kinds of mechanisms that we find in a clock, and they said, oh, you know, I'm going to make a robot out of that, right? And not just a robot, but a robot in the shape of a duck, which is quite hilarious. And so, you know, it's this little clockwork duck, and this was like in the 1700s they created this. So a lot of the kind of earlier AI that I was alluding to, there's a lot of interest in like robotics. So things that appear to be alive. They may not necessarily manifest a lot of intelligence, but you know, it gets very squishy. It's like, what do you consider intelligence to be, right? So, you know, for us, especially in the 1950s, we were thinking like, oh, it's intelligent if it can do chess, right? So we considered that to be a kind of intelligence in the 1950s. I got to tell you, it's pretty easy to make a computer program play really good chess. So but it can't do anything else. So is it really intelligent? But other people have thought about intelligence in a much more embodied way, right? Something is intelligent if it can like go across the room and not run into any obstacles, right? We might think like a Roomba. You might think a Roomba is kind of intelligent because it can kind of go around and vacuum your house, even though Roombas are actually not very intelligent either, right? It can, if they follow very simple rules. So yeah, so a lot of the like historical AI that I was alluding to, a lot of it was in this kind of automaton kind of way of thinking, where they were trying to make something that appeared to be alive or moved, and maybe could do some simple tasks. Here's another historical tidbit that might be interesting in the history of computing. So when you look at the history and where computers came from, right? So one of the forerunners of computing as well was weaving, right? So if I have these weaving machines and I want to kind of automate them, so I want them to store a pattern so that it will weave fabric that has this pattern in it. So now you get into this idea of storing a pattern leads very naturally to storing a program, because as you were saying before, a program, it's binary, right? It's ones and zeros, right? So you can imagine a cloth, right? You can imagine a thread going over or under another thread as it weaves through, right? So the Jacquard loom was a kind of a early influence of stored programs in this way. So yeah, the history of computing is really interesting. And I think to a certain extent, like the history of AI is always kind of running across it. People are always kind of interested in, okay, well, how can I make something kind of human with this, right? And we just kind of keep coming back to it, which is in itself interesting and may say something about us as humans, that we keep wanting to build something human-like that's at the same time artificial.
Yeah, it's you said a few minutes ago, you talked about ambiguity of language, and you can take philosophy courses on language and how it relates to metaphysics and that sort of thing, because what is a word and what does it mean? And I guess intelligence, I'd never really thought about it before, but there's lots of aspects of intelligence that that you alluded to, that I think most of us think about interaction. I say something and something says something back to me, and I interact with the machine. But there's other elements of intelligence that figure into this. I guess what I'm asking is there an agreed upon definition of artificial intelligence? Or are we so early in this that it's kind of an ambiguous term?
So, they say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So I would say intelligence is in the eye of the beholder. It's a bit like that. So, I think conventionally, in the modern era, people have operationalized this idea of intelligence around certain tasks, right? So like this, they'll say, oh, this is a challenging task. So an AI that can do this task, especially one that can do this task at close to a human level of performance, is doing something interesting. I mean, it's noteworthy. So you have all of these different tasks, right? And there's hundreds of tasks that people have created or defined. And then you also have this notion of an artificial general intelligence. And in the scientific community, that's how we refer to it. And this is an AI that can do many of these things, or perhaps all of them, right? So it's no longer like, a master of like looking at an image and identifying the animals that are in it, right? Or hearing a piece of music and identifying what the song is, right? Just like a one-trick pony and all. This is an intelligence and an AI that can do all of these things, right? And so oftentimes when the public uses the term AI, that's informed by what people see in movies and in the media and stuff. That's what they're really thinking about. They're thinking of this artificial general intelligence that in some level has the abilities of a human, not only in one task, but the abilities of a human in many tasks, right? And that's just not where we are. What we have right now is AI. It's just like a bunch of one-trick ponies. And people are working on artificial general intelligence. And there's interesting work that's going on there. But the real progress you see, like in the technologies that you have, like on your smartphone or whatever, those are the results of people pushing on these one-trick pony problems like very hard. And that's so it's weird. It's like on the one hand, people are thinking about AI in this really broad way, but the AI that's actually in the world that people are seeing is not broad. It's like just a bunch of one-trick pony kind of algorithms.
What do you think the relationship to human activity should we be willing to tolerate or to aspire to with AI? I guess what I'm saying, in other words, is, should there be a limit on what we create machines to do if it displaces human activity or dehumanizes the world? Is that a concern in the scientific community?
I think people are very concerned. I mean, people are concerned about all kinds of ethical issues. And it's been really wonderful to see, actually, in the last maybe 5 years, how much traction that's gotten as people realize that the technologies that they're creating have real world implications for better or for worse, and how careful we need to be when we create these models, that we're not creating AIs that have the biases that humans have. So like a classic example of this is what we call language modeling, and people often refer to it as like pre-trained models. So the way that these are deep learning models, and you just take massive amounts of text, like the internet kind of, right? And you push it through a model. So the model learns all these relationships between words and concepts and everything. Well, the problem is that there's a lot of biased speech on the internet, right? There's great speech and there's a lot of hate speech, right? Mm-hmm. And the model learns all of it. So some of these biases and problems that we see in ourselves get reflected in the models, because the models are basically learning from us, learning from our speech. So yeah, people are working on that. It is a challenging problem, and people are definitely thinking along these lines. Now, like going back to what should we allow? I think, with any technology, we need to be really careful about with what the implications are. And certainly to the extent that it somehow diminishes what a person is. And that's a very interesting and complex question. That would be something that we may want to think about, like very, very carefully, right? Or not may, we should think about that very carefully. But when you start talking about like technologies that maybe change industry or change what it means to do a certain kind of work, it's not at all clear to me that what we're talking about is any different from any sort of technological innovation since technology was invented, right? So, like a horse-drawn plow, like seems great to me, right? You need fewer people to like work in the fields. Those people go and they do something else, but that's like good, right? Because now you have them doing all these other different things that produce value. And I think what is in store with AI is going to be similar, that it's just going to create value in other places and create space for people to do other kinds of things. And I don't see that as necessarily bad. If people want to go plow fields by hand, they can go do that. Yep. They probably can't do it professionally and get paid for it because it's just so inefficient. And so I think that's really what we're looking at. Now, what the implications are for society, like, and I'm going to take this very far, right? Because we don't have robots that can replace us. But imagine in a future world, you could go buy an iRobot, right? Like whatever, like iPhone. You can buy an iRobot for, I don't know, I'm going to say $1,000. You could buy an iRobot for $1,000, and it can do like most jobs, right? Then at that point, people don't really need to work professionally, because you basically got like this race of robots, if you want to call it a race of robots. You've got robots that are doing all this work. So then what are people going to do? I don't know. Maybe they'll play video games. Maybe I don't know. They'll find other things to do. And I don't know if society will melt down at that point or something, or I don't know. But it might be fine. I mean, I'm not sure that it's necessarily bad. Of course, if the robots become self-aware and then try to kill us, then there's entire movies about that, or movie franchises about that. So,
well, that's true, and that hopefully that's many years into the future before the robots take over. Although, I don't know that they could do much worse than humans have done running the world. But as an employment lawyer, I deal with a lot of these concepts in different ways, and a lot of it is, there's a big debate about minimum wage, and it seems to me that what's lost in that debate is not so much that the minimum wage is too low. It doesn't matter to me. You can set the minimum wage wherever you want to. But the jobs that generally pay minimum wage are generally entry-level jobs or jobs that you don't really expect to raise a family on. The problem is that we've displaced so many of those jobs that, semi-skilled, unskilled work with technology, and not just artificial intelligence, but just technology, that as a society, we need to have that conversation about, as you say, you're not doing this anymore, you can go do other things. Well, what is that? How do you create economic value? How do you, how do people live if there's less and less demand for human labor, human input? And that's just not a conversation we're having as a society right now. And I think it would be nice to start that conversation while this intrusion, for lack of a better word, into human activity is relatively slight at this point.
right. Let me make a couple of comments on that, because it's that particular piece that you raised, I think is really fascinating. So when we think about job displacement, and I'm not sure what studies there are on this, so I'm just speaking like from my own experience, but talking to people, some of the jobs that are ripe for displacement are actually like middle-class white-collar jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So just about any job that can be mediated through a computer is a job that can potentially be replaced. I was talking to someone who was in financial advising, this was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and he actually sought me out. He was like, hey, you do work in AI. It's just some guy in the community. Can I talk to you about it? I was like, sure. So I talked to him, and he was concerned about robo-advisors. And these are now commonplace, but back then they were just coming out. And he's like, I don't know, how can I charge people 3% to give them financial advice when one of these robo-advisors will do it for free? And it's just like built into a platform, like different, I guess, like Charles Schwab and like Fidelity and whatever, some of these other ones, like they would just incorporate it because it didn't really cost them anything. They would just incorporate it. And then it's like, hey, go with our platform, get this free robo-advisor, right? So, that to me is really interesting, because that kind of job is under threat. Now, when you talk about entry-level jobs, because I've done some work in robotics too, some of those jobs to me seem like they would be very difficult to replace with a robot, but it depends. So like if I'm in a restaurant and I'm a server, it's a very dynamic environment. I mean, there are people getting up and going to tables, there are other servers crisscrossing. I would not want to do that with a robot. I mean, I can't imagine how much that robot would cost, right? Even if I could build it. So that kind of job seems to me to be very difficult to replace. But if you've got an environment that's highly structured, like a factory, like a factory line, like they do this with cars already. You can have robots for manufacturing, or in some of the warehouses, like Amazon warehouses, they're increasingly using robots to automate certain tasks. And now you have humans and robots kind of working together. So it's a fascinating thing, because it doesn't seem like it's just striking like one segment of like just the lower end jobs. It seems like it's just in little pieces. It's kind of sprinkled well, I'm reluctant to say everywhere, but sprinkled, maybe it's not hitting the high-end jobs, although I actually think that's what we need. We need to replace CEOs with robots. So you have like these CEOs who have like 10, $20 million jobs, right? That's 10 or $20 million a year. That's a perfect job to replace with a robot that costs, say, like $5 million. And you save money in like less than a year, right? So that's what we need to do. Just replace the CEOs with robots. We probably have better outcomes.
Yeah, there are some people who would argue that if you replaced some CEOs with robots, that the robots would make more humane decisions than the CEOs do.
Probably.
Yeah, what you say, it is fascinating, because right now I think it's a marginal reduction, and the Great Resignation, whatever you want to call it. I find it fascinating. I have been looking for some studies. I haven't seen any of the kind that you're talking about either. But it's fascinating because a lot of these people are leaving and they're going and they're doing other things. And I'm not sure what they are. I don't know if they're all making money in Bitcoin, or if they're all becoming entrepreneurs with whatever. But I can also go on my phone and get therapy. That's AI therapy. And, that's a job that you would think would never be substituted for a machine, but it is. And there's lots of parts of my profession. There are certain products where I can scan in a legal brief and it'll spit out a responsive brief. And which can be pretty good. So it may not put me out of business, but I may not hire as many support people as a result.
Right.
The self-checkout kiosks in stores may not put everybody out of business, but instead of having 20 people at the checkout line, maybe they've only got 10. That sort of thing. Right. And that's why I say I think we need to have this conversation now, while it's still kind of at the margins, to say, okay, well, my children, as they come up, what should they be thinking in terms of how to prepare themselves for that economy and how to coexist with automation and the AI, rather than seeing it as a threat. Right. Because as you say, nobody really saw the horse and the plow, and then later the tractor, as a threat to agriculture. But over time, we went from being an agricultural dominated labor force to an industrial one. And it seems like those changes are coming quicker and quicker. The first one took hundreds of years, thousands of years, perhaps. The second, we went from the Industrial Revolution to the computer revolution in less than 150 years. So, the next segment may be even quicker.
Yeah, so I agree. That one point you made about training children, that's something, or training the next generation, that's something I think about a lot. It's so two things. So one is, it's so hard, almost impossible really, to predict where things are going. It's like the jobs of the future they don't exist now. They'll exist 10 or 20 years from now, right? And so when you think about like training someone or educating them now, it's like, what do you do? All I can say right now is I think that we should be trying to teach kids at an earlier age. We should be teaching them about data. We should be teaching them about some statistics. We should be teaching them some level of computational thinking and programming, so they at least have these things as almost like literacies. They're like digital literacies, because even if you're not a person who's actually creating these things, you're not creating robots or programming them or whatever, you still may be working with them, and you need to have some level of understanding about how they work so that you can actually do that well, right? It's like, and some of it's going to be a little bit too deep to just pick up just kind of casually, right? Like we teach people how to drive, right? And you can kind of teach someone you can drive and not super know how a car works, right? You need to know that it has like gas and there's warning lights and maybe you should check oil and stuff. You don't necessarily need to understand how the engine works. You can just like take it to a mechanic. I'm not sure that computers they're not the same way now. And I'm not sure they ever will be, because they're just so much more open-ended than like a car that does one thing. And so I think it's important for people and children as they're advancing into the workforce to have more of these like basic literacies so that they can operate well in that like future workforce environment.
Yeah, it's and I think to a large extent, I'm in my 50s, and so I to me the technological apex was somewhere in the 90s. I was adapting, and now I'm just trying to get through to retirement and not get overwhelmed by it all, right? But my children, they've come up with much more automation than I have, and I think they're attuned to that. And I think that it's interesting, even without knowing it. I think our children are more aware of data-driven decisions than I was, or people of my generation were taught to be. So maybe that's some hope that the next generation will figure all of this out.
Hopefully.
Yeah. That's the buzzword in business these days is data-driven decisions, and just my little law firm here, you just generate so much data, and figuring out how to deal with that is going to be the challenge, I think, going forward. And that's certainly where AI can come into play.
Hopefully. Yeah. I could talk about that for hours. Yeah. So AI, I think, can potentially help with managing some of the data, but one of the problems with data, right? And it's kind of like numbers, right? So if you're just expecting the AI to like give you a number or something, it can do that, right? Like you can have some data and you give it to the algorithm makes some sort of prediction, right? It says, oh, you should do this. But you don't know if it's right, And so the only way to know if it's right is to really understand why it made the decision that it made. You want to be able to trace that and explain it. And that's like one of the skills that I really think people need to have. It's like using a legal example. I'm sure familiar with some of the algorithms that people have fielded, some companies have fielded for like making bond decisions, right? Like, oh, this person's a high risk. Well, why are they a high risk? Well, the algorithm said so, right? And then it turns out that they train these algorithms on all sorts of historical data from like a biased justice system. So now the algorithms have bias. So if the person's Black, then they get denied bail, right? And it just, and so that's like deeply, deeply problematic. And when we have these models, it's important to I don't know if even trust but verify is right. I think you should always be skeptical of what they're telling you, because they can. It's one of these interesting things actually about AI and machine learning. When they're right, it seems like magic, but the ways that they're wrong are ways that a human would never be wrong, and they're just spectacularly, mind-bogglingly wrong. And you see this like there's a whole subfield of AI. It's called adversarial AI. You see it a lot of work in vision, right? And what people will do, it's very popular with self-driving car, or very known as the self-driving car area. So you'll have like a self-driving car. It's got imagery like from its camera system of the road and stop signs and stuff, right? And what they'll do is they'll change some aspect of the image in a way that a human can't even perceive. right? Like you can't even tell that the image changed, but it'll be like some like wavelength of noise or something scattered throughout the image. I mean, human, you can't even tell, but all of a sudden the AI will be like, that's not a stop sign. Like that's not a stop sign. That's a squirrel, right? And you're like, no. It's like, and you could never, like a human would never switch between a stop sign and a squirrel. You might be like, well, it's a sign. It's some kind of sign. It's red, but it's not a stop sign. What could that be? Could it be maybe a one-way sign or something like that? Like it would be something else, but it wouldn't be like a squirrel.
Right. You know, whenever I get into this kind of conversation, I'm always reminded about a short story that Isaac Asimov wrote, and I don't remember the name of it, but the summary of the story was this young kid wanted to become a programmer. That's what he wanted to be. Mm-hmm. And at this point in this society, got to be a certain age, and they took you out and they tested you, and then they decided what your most aptitude was. And if it was to be a doctor, then you went to this place, they put a hat on you, and you were a doctor because it would infuse all this knowledge in you. And he took the test, and they came to him and they said, I'm sorry, but you're not going to be, there was a word for it, you're not going to be indoctrinated or assimilated or whatever. It was actually a more friendly name than that. And this was a big rite of passage in this society. So you're going to go over here and go to this special school because your brain isn't wired to just accept the knowledge. Long story short, or short story even shorter, it turns out that the people who went to the special school were the really smart people that that were going to become programmers because they needed to know what was behind the programming. They didn't just need to be, if they were just given the superficial how to do the job, then there wouldn't be any innovation of programming. And so they really had to understand 360 all the way around it. And I've just always kind of turned that story around in my mind because it really does suggest that the substance of these things is way more important than we think. And I think that goes along with what you just said about understanding the model and how the model is set up, because it's like anything else. You can set it up to achieve a certain unfair result if that's what you're interested in doing.
Right. Yeah, I like that story. I haven't read that one. I've read some Asimov, and of course you get the 3 laws of robotics and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But that story reminds me of a conversation I was having with someone the other day about deep learning, right? So one of the problems with deep learning is it's so hard to explain what the models are doing. And this is an active research area. People are working on it. There's some interesting methods and results that people have. But overall, it's really hard to tell what's going on, what it's doing, right? And so there's actually a point, I think, where we are right now with some of these, the deep learning models in particular, where you're no longer talking so much about like the kind of knowledge that comes from like programming or statistics to understand what they're doing. It's actually more like psychology. Like now you're the psychologist trying to understand the AI because the AI is so complicated. That's the only way to do it, right? So like basically use psychology to figure out what's going on in its quote mind. And so it's kind of a funny way of thinking about it. And, you know, some analogies with that Asimov story.
Well, the other example I'll give you, if you're prone to conspiracy theories, this is a way this sort of thing I think could go awry. Many people who are sports fans may remember, but a lot of people don't remember him. It's a fellow named Roy Kramer, who was the commissioner of the Southeastern Conference, Athletic Conference, back in the 90s. And at that point, the sports conferences were not that important. Now they're everything. He was the architect of the old BCS, the Bowl Championship Series system. And he was in charge of developing the computer program that ranked the teams, because there was all this, consternation about, well, you get these polls and a lot of human error and subjective and that sort of thing. So he creates this computer program to decide who's going to be in the bowl championship series, allocating big money. You fast forward to today, largely regarded as the Southeastern Conference, at least in football, is the most powerful, best football conference. I've often wondered whether that original model was set up to favor the Southeastern Conference because he was the commissioner for the Southeastern Conference, and that's who came out on top. And that's a long con, that's a long play, but it seems to me that that's a danger. That if you're the one creating the model, you can create a model to get desired outcomes. And I realize that, no matter how much planning you do, you may get an undesired outcome. But it's, that's always the back of my mind. I've always wondered how much that really had to do with the predominance of the Southeastern Conference, because 20, 30 years ago, there wasn't that much difference between the major conferences from either a perception standpoint or money standpoint, and now that gulf is huge. So I don't know. What do you? Am I crazy? What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a really so I don't know anything about that specific case. That's a fascinating bit of history there. But I agree with the sentiment that if you're creating a model and no one else gets to see what that model is, that's just rife with potential problems. So in the machine learning community, the way that we address this is with a culture of openness. So people release the source code to their models, people release the data sets, and it actually creates a kind of virtuous cycle because people can evaluate each other really well. They can confirm that things are working and then build on each other's work. So it's a real accelerator. But you need that openness to create trust, right? And this is the problem, like going back to some of the bail decision algorithms. When you have these proprietary algorithms, they're not open, you can't have that trust and you can't have explainability. So I don't know if this is something that needs to be in law somehow. I could potentially see how you could try to craft a legal framework that maybe has some parallels with how we do drug trials, where there's some sort of regulatory agency and it's monitoring these drug trials and people have to register it and they basically have to prove and verify that things are working a certain way, and it can be challenged and there can be adverse reporting and stuff. Like maybe there's some kind of legal framework that can be created so that people have confidence that the AI is doing what it's supposed to be doing and hasn't been hacked, or however you want to, doesn't have the person who created it doesn't have some sort of secret influence that creates the outcomes that they want, because that just undermines everything, right? If you don't have confidence in what it's doing, it just undermines everything.
It's like scales and gasoline pumps and other thing. We just take at face value. Well, it's giving me $5 worth of gasoline, but you trust that the government has come around and checked it.
Right.
And so I guess the great thing that has come out of this conversation is it sounds like the one thing we will always have with us is lawyers, because someone will have to evaluate that legal structure and argue about whether it's been achieved, et cetera.
Well, so I hate to tell you this, Alan, but I do have this idea for AI lawyers.
Yeah. God love them. God, so if you have a machine to do what I do, God love it.
Let me give you a scenario, right? So
okay, let's hear it.
This is a future scenario, right? So I'm driving my car, have a car accident, right? Doesn't matter if it's my fault, the other person's fault. We get out of our cars. It's like, hey, are you okay? Yeah, we're both okay. Pull out our smartphones. The AI lawyers on our smartphones start duking it out, right? it's, back and forth, black box on the car, all the data. Okay, you get $50, you get nothing, done, right? Get back in your car, you just keep on going, right? So anyway, that's my vision. Of course, you couldn't do everything that way, right? But for some of these like kind of smaller things that are rife with paperwork and insurance claims and just get kind of ridiculous for piddly things. I'm looking forward to a future where we can just handle it very quickly and easily without getting it overly complicated.
There are some apps and programs and services that will do that, where you do a virtual arbitration, you submit your dispute, and some artificial intelligence evaluates it and gives you an opinion. Also automated mediation where it goes back and forth. I think for certain things that would be good. If the human element comes into that, you'd have to get the insurance companies to agree, if we're still using insurance, that they would be bound by that. And there you really would worry about, is somebody fooling with the algorithm, because it's big money to insurance companies. So,
right.
I think that's the thing is you get the human element in, and we live in a fallen world, and somebody's always going to try to scam a good system for their own benefit. And, that's why I think ultimately you're going to have human oversight of all of this. So, maybe artificial intelligence can take some of that arbitrariness out of these decisions. That would be a nice future.
Mm-hmm. But I agree with you. I think there'll always be a need for lawyers, and probably lawyers who are well informed about AI, right, and how these things work, because it's just gonna keep going, right?
Classes, doctor, and figure this out.
I'll try.
All right. Well, that's about all the time we have. In fact, we've gone over a little bit, but this, Dr. Olney, this has been a fascinating conversation. I hope our listeners have enjoyed this as much as I have. I'm like you, I could talk about this sort of thing for a long time, and you are certainly a patient and clear communicator when it comes to these concepts, because they're big concepts and they're complicated, and to a lot of us, they're kind of foreign. So the more we all talk about this, I think the better off we are.
Thank you, Alan. Good to be with you.
All right, everybody. Thank you for watching. Please share this on social media. Email it to someone you think might enjoy it. Dr. Olney is going to go innovate for the future. I'm going to go get some justice. So thank you all very much.